Hello, and welcome back to the 2023 CCSE Research Conference, Politics, Communication, and Polarization, hosted by the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement and the Brian Lamb School of Communication at Purdue University. I'm Andrea Langrish, Managing Director of the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement. Before we get started, please be sure you have your camera turned on so our speakers can see you and your microphone is on mute. You'll use the raise hand function during the Q&A portion of the session. Moderating this panel is Jessica Collier, Assistant Professor in the Brian Lamb School of Communication at Purdue University. Jessica obtained a Ph.D. in Communication Studies from the University of Texas at Austin, including a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Media Engagement. Additionally, she holds an MA in Mass Communication from UNC Chapel Hill and BA degrees in Psychology and Government from the University of Virginia. Her research centers on the interactions between media organizations and technology platforms, examining their impact on democracy, both positive and negative. Currently, her focus lies in the exploration of how exposure to various forms of social media content, including fact checks, misinformation, and memes, influences accurate beliefs, polarization, and online social behaviors, such as blocking and unfriending. Jessica's scholarly contributions have been published in multiple academic journals, and she has presented her research at academic conferences, and industry-related meetings across the nation. Join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Collier.
Thank you, Andrea. So this panel is titled Language in Times of Crisis, Spirit, Scandal, and Everything in Between. In this panel, we have two papers that delve into intriguing aspects of American politics and communication. The first explores the sensitive realm of political sex scandals and situational crisis communication theory. The research analyzes the crisis response strategies that are employed by political figures in the face of sex scandals, as well as the reactions of the general public. And then the second paper dives into a unique and largely understudied area, the impact and rhetorical functions of spiritual advisors to the US presidency as they've evolved over the past 40 years. The research takes a qualitative content analysis approach to uncover the major themes and roles in public presidential spiritual advisor discourse, constructing a typology of spiritual advisor functions. And I will introduce our first paper, which is co-authored by Amanda Lilly, an assistant professor at Utah State University, and our presenter today, Caitlin Brooks. Caitlin is currently a PhD candidate in the Brian Lamb School of Communication at Purdue. She researches political influence and discourse on social media, and her dissertation will be exploring how government agencies present themselves and their resources to TikTok audiences through content analysis and interviews. Caitlin also studies crisis communication, such as how Twitter users discuss the Capitol insurrection and political figures' sex scandals. So please join me in welcoming Caitlin.
I'm sorry, Caitlin is trying to log in. Unfortunately, the Wi-Fi is not cooperating. So Andrea, Terry, I hope you are up and ready to go. Jessica, if you'd like to do Andrea's introduction, that would be great.
Absolutely. So Andrea is an assistant professor of rhetoric in the Communication Studies Department at Cal State University, Sacramento. Her research concerns the intersection of political and religious discourse with emphases on Christian evangelicalism and the US presidency. Her work has been published in the Journal of Common Religion, Communication Inquiry, and the Journal of Religion, Media, and Digital Culture. Her current research projects focus on the rhetorical function of spiritual advisors to the US presidency and social media discourse of individuals who identify as ex-evangelical. So please join me in welcoming Andrea.
Hey, folks. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen and get going here. All right. Is that looking okay to everybody? Okay. So thank you so much for being here. As was just said by Jessica, my name is Andrea Terry. I'm an assistant professor of rhetoric in the Communications Studies Department at CSU Sacramento. This presentation is an initial overview of some of the data analysis from a book project that I'm working on. this presentation is a little bit more taking some broad strokes, looking at presidential spiritual advisors from Reagan to Trump and mapping that rhetorical terrain. So just to get into this briefly, during the 2016 presidential election, a lot of things happened. One of the things that stood out to me was the coalition of evangelicals that got on board with Donald Trump. And throughout Trump's presidency, it became clearer and clearer that he was using his spiritual advisor, Paula White, in kind of a different way that I had seen before. And so as this went on, we got a bunch of different memes coming from the interactions between White and Trump, including this one, which was very interesting to me. And this led me to ask the question, what is going on with these spiritual advisors? I started delving into the research, and in communication studies and also across sociology, political science, these folks have not really been studied systematically. What we do know about is we know about things like White House prayer breakfasts and things that spiritual advisors do in those areas. We know about their role in inaugurations and memorial prayer services. And we know a bit about one specific individual who's very prominent as a spiritual advisor, which is Billy Graham. However, this leaves out a lot of other folks who have played a number of different roles as ancillaries to different presidents' rhetorical strategies. So when I was looking at this, I came at it from the standpoint of the rhetorical presidency, which is this idea that presidents communicate with the public using their bully pulpit, quote unquote, typically would go through the legacy media in order to communicate things with the broader public. However, recently, as Jennifer Murcia argues, we've seen a turn to the post-rhetorical presidency, which is presidents using things like social media to go over the heads of traditional media sources and speak directly to the public. And so with these changes in technology, I was also wondering, well, how have the roles of these folks changed? So when I was looking for a starting point in this research, I thought that it would be useful to go back and see with the beginning of one of the most prominent spiritual advisors, Billy Graham, what there was in the C-SPAN video archive to tell me about those public-facing roles. And so I'm starting in this research project with Ronald Reagan's presidency and then going through the presidency of Donald Trump. So this led me to three kind of key questions. First of all, when we're looking at these folks with all these different roles, what exactly is a spiritual advisor in the context of the US presidency? They've been kind of very loosely defined. If you look at different biographies, different autobiographies, different materials, they're defined in different ways. I also wanted to know more about the specific rhetorical function of these individuals and how those functions have changed over time. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to focus in on what a spiritual advisor is, go through some of my methodology, my findings, key considerations, and then I just have a couple of acknowledgements for some folks who've helped me with this research. So when I was trying to figure out how to define spiritual advisors, one of the key pieces of research that I found that was really helpful came from David Flores, who wrote this paper called The Joseph Dilemma, and he defined spiritual advisors as being in one of three main categories. So he argues that there is first a lobbyist kind of spiritual advisor who is an individual who petitions the president on individuals that are closely related to that person's faith-based worldviews. The second category he points out is the chaplain, which is more connected personally to the president and dedicated to the spiritual well-being of whoever is president. This is the person who prays with them, counsels them. And then finally, we have the focus group, which typically, according to Flores, tends to be a board or a council of religious leaders that are chosen by someone close to the president to provide insight and advice in different situations relating to religion. So when I found this starting typology, based on just what I had initially looked at with what was happening in Trump's presidency with Paula White, I thought, oh, there's some work to be done here. We can definitely start to use this as a starting point to define who counts as a spiritual advisor and what roles those folks take on. So I combed through a number of different news reports, autobiographies, biographies of the different presidents from this time period. So Reagan, Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, and Trump, to see who they kind of claimed as a spiritual advisor and look specifically for folks who would have fallen into one of these three different categories. From that, I decided that to start, based on my perspective, looking more at a public address kind of function, I decided that I would focus on the more public facing functions of spiritual advisors to president. That meant that most of the kind of focus group stuff probably wasn't going to play out. But I used the C-SPAN video archives to collect data on these individuals that I had identified, 18 people in total across 6 presidencies. And I did a keyword search in the C-SPAN video archives by the name of the advisor and basically created a big database of all of the videos of all of the appearances for those spiritual advisors. And I say I did this with the help of a few research assistants that I was able to get through my university. So after we had created the database, we coded those appearances by the type of event and did some iterative work back and forth to discuss what we thought the different roles were that were going on there, and then identified them by name as well. And then we arranged them in a couple of different ways. We arranged them chronologically and then grouped them by event to see kind of what we could find. And so what I have coming up next is just some of the trends that we saw. I think these are interesting. So when we were trying to figure out what kind of typology kind of we wanted to go with, this is still a bit in development, but the things that we settled on first were that the key roles, we saw kind of 5 key roles. The first one was an invocation or a prayer. So this was largely a ceremonial role that would happen at events like inaugurations and different kinds of prayer events. So for example, the National Day of Prayer or the President-elect's prayer service, different things like that that occur. We also saw a fair number of eulogies where a sitting president's spiritual advisor would be asked to come and give a eulogy and on the death of a person closely connected to the presidency. And then we saw an emergence, or not emergence, but an uptick in the roles of spiritual advisors as speakers. So these folks actually giving public speeches at different kinds of events, often on behalf of the president or supporting a president's particular policies. And then there were a number of appearances that were interviews where folks were being interviewed about their interactions with the president. So it wasn't a formal speaking event, it was more a back and forth interview. And then during the Trump presidency specifically, we see this emergence of a new category that the only way I could describe it was hype. So this is where you have folks like Paula White at a situation where Trump is signing some sort of bill and he has a cluster of people around him. And he did this a number of times. He would ask Paula to say a few words and Paula would just thank Trump for doing everything that he is doing and basically pump him up before everybody claps. So I didn't know how else to describe this role except for that her specific function in those moments was literally just to hype up Trump and thank him for everything that he's doing for evangelicals. So as you can see in this graph, the role of speaker really jumped up during the Obama administration. One of the things that's important to note there is that Obama had the largest cadre of official spiritual advisors, and those folks wound up having speaking engagements at a number of different events. His spiritual advisor cadre was also by far the most diverse, involving people across a number of different faith perspectives. So those were kind of 2 big interesting things that I found. In addition, if you look at the trends over time for how often spiritual advisors give different kinds of public appearances, Reagan and Bush 41, not much at all. But with Clinton, you see a huge jump in the use of spiritual advisors. Billy Graham did a bunch of speaking on behalf of, not on behalf of, but had a bunch of different public functions related to Clinton, such as a prayer service after the Oklahoma City bombing and a number of prayer breakfasts and different things, as well as his other spiritual advisors, I think one of which was Tony Campolo. Bush 43, again, a huge number, and the number just increases even more with Obama. And so if we look at this over time, it's clear that across these presidencies, spiritual advisors are playing an increasingly public-facing role, doing things to communicate something about the role of religion in public life as it relates to the US presidency. And with Trump, taking this into context, there's 13 appearances, but that was only for one term. So if it would have continued, quite likely would have been on par with Obama, if not exceeding Obama as things ramped up. So based on all of this, I kind of have some key findings and considerations to go over. First of all, as shown in the last graph, the public speaking engagements for spiritual advisors to US presidents have increased dramatically over time. These folks are having increasingly public roles. I haven't gotten into what's going on with Biden. He seems a bit different, but it'll be interesting to see what continues and really dive into what these individuals' appearances tell us about what it means to do one's faith in public. There are also 5 main public roles of spiritual advisors that we saw on this initial pass over the data. So we have prayer leaders, eulogists, subject matter speakers, interviewees, and the hype person. So the roles, the ceremonial function of spiritual advisors remains pretty stable, but that addition of a more deliberative function where spiritual advisors are speaking directly on behalf of a president at different events is where the increase in the spiritual advisor appearances is really coming from. And then finally, as I was going through this, one of the things that I was thinking, as someone who is in California, which until very recently, I could not use state money to go to certain states and do research, was that looking at archival data from these presidents would really have helped to further contextualize how these roles have evolved. And so kind of the next step in this research, now that I have kind of a broad view of what's going on, is to dig in deeper, comparing what I have from the C-SPAN video library to what was going on behind the scenes that we can get from looking at archives. So the last bit here is I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the Sacramento State Research and Creative Activity Program, which funded this research, and my research assistants that got paid through that program, Lucas, Kaisis Wilson, Cecilia Lerda, and Kaylee Jonas. They were instrumental in tracking down videos and transcribing them so that we could start this very important work. And moving forward, I'm really excited to see what continues to happen as we dig into figuring out how these roles have evolved and how they help us to understand what it means to perform one's religion in the public sphere. So at that, I'm happy to take questions if it's time for questions.
Yes, thank you so much. The floor is open for questions, anyone? Yeah, Bryce.
Yeah, so yeah, I find the general idea of advisors to be like an interesting topic, spiritual or otherwise, just because it's really a hard like identification strategy of figuring out kind of where does the advisor begin, where does the advisor end when you're looking at something like presidential rhetoric. And so you were mentioning at the end the like the importance of getting this like archival contextual information. Is that how you plan on getting into that question?
Yeah.
Sorry, for some reason I can't hear your audio.
Contextual arc.
That might be my problem, not yours. Yeah, if you restart your answer, I didn't hear the audio at the beginning. I think that was me.
Are we working now? Good now? Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So thank you. So that's definitely the next step. So I mean, by training, I'm a rhetorical critic, and so digging in and getting into all that kind of deep contextual information is something that I'm definitely going to want to do. There is a whole archival collection at the George W. Bush Library that is just communications with George W. Bush and his spiritual advisors. It's a very large collection. I'm really looking forward to digging into it, but yes, that's definitely the next step here. And getting like Flores's work is a really good starting point, but really I want a better definition of what a spiritual advisor is. And I definitely would like to add a lot more nuance to these categories that I just can't get at with what I have now.
Okay. I had two observations on the data presentation. I just wonder whether eulogies, because they're so chancy, because you don't know who's going to die and what the president's going to do, whether they shouldn't go in with invocations. But anyway, that's a grouping question. On the other table where you have Trump, I wonder if you wouldn't be better off showing those in 4-year terms. That way they would be all comparable. Because 41 had 4 years. Reagan only has a small amount in the video library, and then Trump has 1 year. And so it would show by, other than standardizing by years, that would be another way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had that thought as I was rerunning through my presentation this morning,
Mhm.
that really to kind of get a better idea of the trends.
Yeah. And
Splitting out by year would be better.
And with Obama and that one very tall chart, you said he had a cadre, so it's not the same person. Is that right? He's got lots of different people making.
They all had multiple people, but Obama had the largest group. So if you look at, for example, let me pull this up. I didn't want to like just provide a whole bunch of lists.
Yeah.
But for example, if we look at, let me scroll down here. If we look at Bill Clinton, like his spiritual advisors, his kind of official folks were Billy Graham, Philip Blogeman, Tony Campolo, and Bill Hybels. So he had 4. Bush had Kirbyjon Caldwell, Ted Haggard, Billy Graham, James Mayfield, and Mark Craig. And then Obama had many more than that. So everybody, starting with Clinton, you have people having multiple spiritual advisors that have a public facing kind of function. But then with Obama, you've got Kirbyjon Caldwell, you've got, well, for a minute, and then Jim Wallace, he has Rabbi David Saperstein, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, Joshua Du Bois, who was like the president's pastor, his really close person, so would fulfill kind of that chaplain role that Flores talks about. And then Joel Hunter, Dennis McDonough, Rashad Hussein, Melissa Rogers, Sharon Watkins. So those are all people who were either in the material on Obama, either listed as spiritual advisors or part of his spiritual cabinet, which was something that was a bit unique to him. I mean, at one point, Clinton had what he called his religious brain trust, which was comprised of the individuals I mentioned earlier. So everybody has multiple people. Obama just has more.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you again. next, I will introduce our first speaker again now. We have Caitlin Brooks. This paper is co-authored with Amanda Lilly, who's an assistant professor at Utah State University. And then our presenter today is Caitlin Brooks. She's currently a PhD candidate in the Brian Lamb School here at Purdue. She researches political influence and discourse on social media, and her dissertation will be exploring how government agencies present themselves and their resources to TikTok audiences through content analysis and interviews. So please welcome Caitlin.
Hi, thank you so much for your patience with tech issues and such. I greatly appreciate it, and Amanda wishes that she could be here as well. 2-hour time delay, and she is teaching. I will go ahead and pull up my slides for y'all. Are things showing up on y'all's end? Fantastic. Love it when tech works. So Amanda and I are looking at sex scandals in politics through the C-SPAN library, combining my interest in political communication and Amanda's interests in sexual communication. And so a quick overview of what we've got in this presentation is we'll give a little bit of a background, talk a little bit about the methods and data that we've used, as well as the findings and conclusion. So for a very brief background, sex scandals are, of course, nothing new. The oldest sex scandal, of course, in America being the Reynolds pamphlet between Alexander Hamilton and his sordid affair back in the 1700s. So there have, of course, been many more since the 1700s. So each time these events take place, there's going to be some kind of negative consequences, particularly for the people involved, as well as it leads to a broader sort of national concern as well of like where we stand in our culture and such. And so sex often sells, as we see in media. And so it's often treated as both sort of a shameful topic in that politicians should not engage in sexual scandals, but it is also very engaging. Again, sex very much sells. So as a result, some people can be very uncomfortable talking about sex. So we can see through sex scandals that there's it illuminates some sex norms, how we understand sexual relations in our society. And these norms are going to be very much gendered through these expectations. So for example, thinking of, for example, one of the most famous examples of the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal back in the 90s, where Monica Lewinsky still to this day is often the butt of many jokes. So although some norms can be changing, these changes may be a bit slower to reach the politicians themselves. So it's also important to consider the impact of sexual misconduct, such as the impact it can have on their careers, such as resigning and or not being elected into office that we've seen particularly recently, as well as the impacts on their own personal lives, since at the end of the day, people are at the center of this and are experiencing it. And so we look at sex scandals as personal crises. And so we use the situational communication crisis theory to sort of guide our framework. SCCT, it's a very common crisis communication theory. So its core premise is that crisis responses are going to be most effective when they account for crisis variables such as the attribution, so how responsible someone is for the crisis at hand. With sex scandals, they often are very much held responsible for doing these acts, as well as crisis history. So in this context, have they been embroiled in sex scandals already? Their broader reputation, and things of those concerns. So SECT is often applied to organizational contexts. That's where a lot of crisis communication theory research stems from, corporate contexts. And so SECT recommends response strategies that are paired with their crisis type. And so for sex scandals, they're pretty much almost always going to be preventable crises. So in other words, the politician could have prevented this from happening by not doing the thing. And other crisis types being victim, they had no control over what was going on. Accidental, also very limited control. They're probably not held too responsible, though could have potentially prevented it more. And with their response strategies, they group them in by denying, diminishing, or repairing and rebuilding. So with preventable crises, you're going to want to use, according to SECT, repair and rebuild strategies, where you're taking responsibility, you're apologizing, at least in a corporate context, you may be compensating victims for their pain, suffering, financial losses, anything like that. And additionally, they're also going to be bolstering. So by reminder, they're going to be reminding people, hey, I am not a terrible human. Look at all these good things that I've done before. Ingratiation, they're going to be appealing to their supporters, praising their supporters for standing by them. And victimage, they're going to claim that they are the true victims or part of being a true victim to the crisis. And so we have seen sex scandals use SECT in research, very recent research, even though, again, it's mostly applied to corporate contexts. Boyle et al. Published just technically next month a fantastic article looking at comparing Biden and Trump's sex scandals using SECT before their elections, and found that with sex scandals in politics that maybe they can get away with successfully having mismatched response strategies than what SECT suggests. And so last little bit about SECT, it's often studied using experiments. And so while it tries to link the responses to the the figures' responses to how the public reacts, how stakeholders react to it, there often isn't that link in the studies themselves. It's often studied in a vacuum. And so we try to study that together. And that's one thing that I think is really important about our study, that we study both the responses and the reactions in one study together. And so what we were asking is sort of two parts. How do the public figures respond to sex scandals that they're implicated in? And are there any partisan or longitudinal differences? So does it change by party or time? As well as the public reaction using the open phones call-in participants. How are they reacting to these scandals? And are they reacting sort of differently based on party, gender, or time-based lines? And so to do this, we did two sort of studies. We did a content analysis as well as a thematic analysis. For the content analysis, we looked at figures' responses that were available in the C-SPAN library. So looking up different politicians' names that we knew with very much confidence would be in there, like I mentioned before, Clinton, Kavanaugh. And so we found 10 figures across 11 videos. And for our coding scheme, we use Kuhn's SECT response strategies like I outlined before. And we had 3 coders, Amanda and myself coded, as well as her research assistant, Alana. And so they included Hart, Cuomo, Wiener, Clinton, Frankenmore, Thomas, Kavanaugh, Hill, and Kane. And so these span from like the 80s all the way up to very, very recent. And for thematic analysis, we looked at the public reactions in the open phone lines. We identified 418 unique callers across 11 figures, most of which were also present in the content analysis, but some weren't. And so because 418 is a lot to go through and code qualitatively, we sampled about 20 to 40% of callers per figure. So every figure was roughly equally represented in our data, and this ended up with 100 videos, unintentionally, nice neat round number, that we qualitatively analyzed. And so the key figures that were not present in the content analysis because we couldn't see their explicit responses to the sex scandal through C-SPAN. They were responding elsewhere, like in mainstream media, were Matt Gaetz and Joe Biden. And so some quick findings that we had. Here's our intercoded reliability and just how frequently these codes appeared. Some things to note, some of the strategies are much easier to spot. For example, apologies, I am sorry, very easy to spot. Meanwhile, deny is also very easy to spot. I did not do this, this is false. And so it just goes to show how sort of tricky some of these strategies can be to code. With frequency, we found attacking the accusers as well as asserting themselves as a victim in the scandal were the most frequent to occur, while justification, so trying to minimize the perceived impact of the scandal of it's not that bad, guys, was the least used. And so while we did do some chi-square analysis to see if there are any statistical significant differences by party or time, and you can see we did 15-year chunks. None of them were statistically significant, likely because we had a very small sample number. But some things that are worth pointing out, I believe, are still highlighting the sort of flip of how frequently Democrats, as you can see here on the left, are to apologize for a sex scandal compared to Republicans apologizing only once. That was Thomas's video, and it was very much a qualified apology of, if I did something to make Anita Hill feel this way, I'm sorry. But not explicitly taking full responsibility of, I did do this, I am sorry. And on the flip side, denying, where, as you can see, Republicans were much more frequently denying the allegations altogether versus one Democrat that denied altogether, and that being Cuomo. And so some of the things that we can take away from this is that a range of responses were used throughout their responses. Again, they were not very different in most aspects, and important difference in apologizing versus denying. And again, not statistically significantly different, but Democrats did use more of those different strategies within a response on average compared to Republicans. They used about 5 strategies on average versus closer to like 3 to 4 strategies on average. For thematic analysis, a quick overview of how callers were evaluating the accusations and the accusers. Most, as you can see, did not get a clear stance, either because they were off topic, not substantively addressing the allegations in their call, or they weren't very clear in what the response was. It could be interpreted either way. But other than that, there were many, many doubts and interesting mixed support in which people believe that something happened to the accuser, but either this person specifically wasn't responsible, or that, yeah, something maybe happened. Yeah, he maybe did it, but look at all of these good things that he did. So some additional themes, we found 7 unique themes through our data, including comparing them to other sex scandal crises that people have gone through, missing the bigger picture, so other important issues, calling the other side hypocrites for how they are responding to sex scandals, calling sex scandals political weapons to be used strategically. With doubts, this ties in very much together. Significant number of doubts were questioning the timing, and also ties in with being used as political weapons. But why now? All of these accusers. Why now? Was a very, very common phrase that they used. They also shared personal and communal experience that I'll jump into a little bit more, as well as times have or haven't really changed much. And so one theme that I want to really stress on, because it was the most surprising for us, was this personal and communal experience. Callers often referenced their own personal experience with sexual assault or sexual harassment, and often it was women sharing their experiences. And so not all of these experiences were used to affirm or believe the accusers, though many were. Some of the sort of experiences were used to diminish and sort of poke holes into the accusation and allegations. So, for example, one caller, he referenced how his dad was falsely accused of sexual harassment because he just loved using pet names that he picked up when living in Great Britain. Or another woman, when talking about the Kavanaugh case, used her daughter's personal experience for this sort of mixed support of believing something did happen to Ford. She was telling the truth that she experienced trauma, but her identification with Kavanaugh as a person made her believe that it wasn't Kavanaugh who was responsible. And so that thing really stood out for us as well. And so some important longitudinal, partisan, and gender differences. For longitudinal, we saw that more recent scandal callers were particularly concerned with post-scandal impacts, such as on SCOTUS legitimacy, state, local politics representativeness. For example, with Franken being, with him resigning, concern about who's going to fill that spot, similarly for Weiner as well. For partisan differences, unsurprisingly, many people swore party allegiance, where they were supporting their person, their party, no matter what, though it did seem at least a few more Democrats compared to Republicans were wanting more accountability comparatively. Additionally, very small amount, but still noticeable, there were some allegations of perceived bias on behalf of C-SPAN, that C-SPAN allegedly wasn't covering issues, wasn't sharing full evidence. And these were mostly made by Republicans, particularly during the Kavanaugh cases that we saw. For gendered, we saw that women were much more likely to believe accusers, and they were to highlight that they thought that the coverage of the sex scandals was inappropriate. One caller during the Clinton scandal was particularly concerned about, how am I going to explain this to my 7-year-old, the president's sex habits, because it's all over the internet now. And those kind of concerns were mostly reserved for, and most exclusively made actually by female callers. And so in conclusion, again, some quick limitations, very small sample size. We can't make a lot of generalizability claims. Additionally, and it's important to note that while we're using C-SPAN open phones as sort of a proxy for public reactions, they are not a perfect representation of the public because they are very motivated to call into C-SPAN to begin with. Whereas the average, most American voters either can't get on the phone because just not enough airtime, or because they just aren't as interested. And so some quick implications to take away is that the response, like what Boyle et al. Found, is that the response may quality and whether it matches SCCT may not matter in political sex scandals. Additionally, it's important that we understand and recognize that sex scandals, particularly for the public, are understood through a broader political context by these callers, such as pointing out other issues that are going on, comparing to other politicians, the broader political spheres, how they're understanding these sex scandals. And then lastly, as times have been changing, I can't get into everything. It seems like there may be some shifting gender and sexual norms in our society that, for the better, I would say, make sexual assault and sexual harassment much more accountability on that front. And so with that, that is all I have for y'all, and I am happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability.
Yes, Robert, you have a question?
Yeah, first of all, I think you've got too small a data set, meaning that there are other scandals like Edwards and Sanford and the governor. There was a governor in either Massachusetts or New Jersey that was a gay scandal. And anyway, so I wonder if you would search in the video library that you might find more than just your a priori kind of search. The second thing is, did you think about using the video at all? Some people, I don't know, there's published papers on it, but I know people have been interested in how the accused person appears in, do they have their wounded spouse standing there as a prop? Some refuse to do that. It's been criticized by media, journalists, etc. I just wondered if you had thought about using any of the video or video pictures to sort of say the setting in which people answered the questions.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is probably a lot more that we could explore on that front. I just think for this current study, SECT doesn't really make any recommendations about like how should you present yourself. It focuses very much on the sort of substance, the words of the response. In terms of trying to find others as well, we definitely could probably still look some more since there is so much to try to sift through as well. We had like a long list that we compiled of like politicians we knew were embroiled in sex scandals. I think I remember the one that you referenced. I can't remember their name though. But for some of them, we simply struggled to be able to find a clear video. So for example, we really wanted to have Helen Chenoweth in our data set to try and have some gender differences as well, since we only had Katie Hill. But the only videos we could find, at least as we were searching, were videos of like a newscast about her response to the allegations rather than her response itself. So we could probably improve our search terms on that front.
Bryce, you had a question?
Yes, thank you for the talk. So what drew me to this abstract and this proposal way back when was, I applaud you using a part of C-SPAN that is not just what it appears on in terms of like floor debates, because there's a lot of other things that go on the channel that would be of interest. And ironically, like there's been a lot of water cooler conversations that I've had specifically about these call-in shows. Because I do think that they're interesting. You're right that there's like a bias in terms of the sample. But something that I always thought was fascinating about these is that I called them like the history of the United States according to Larry, which is like they have these callers who just call in like every week or like every other week. And it's like citizens from around the country that are just like giving their 2 cents on literally everything that's happening in Washington, D.C. And I always found that those were just really fascinating. And I think the type of analysis that you're doing is exactly how you would leverage that. You would analyze that type of data. Like it would make no sense to do like, machine learning or something like that on like a few citizen calls over the course of like 10 years. But I just think it's really fascinating that that you get these people. And then there's also like a relationship that develops between the caller and the host like over time. So it's like the same people and they have this like rapport with the host that's I think is just really fascinating too. And so I think that you're right that the sample maybe not be, it's selection bias to the nth degree. But I think you can really lean into it with this sort of project and just say like, this is just interesting in and of itself to just see how these people engage with scandals over time. So I was curious what kind of your next steps are. Is this more kind of like a one-off project, or are you actually generally interested in these types of call-ins in C-SPAN or I mean, it can honestly be in a number of different forums outside of C-SPAN as well. So I'm just curious to hear where you're going with it.
Yeah, no, I am definitely interested in more of these open calls, particularly because of some of them are just really, really wild. And so I would love to potentially, like, if not about like sex scandals particularly, just to try to get a more lay of the land of like, what are people really interested in talking about? Um, who is the kind of person that would call into C-SPAN is one thing. As I was doing this project with Amanda, that was just in the back of my head of like, what are these people? What are these people like? Why are they so invested to calling into C-SPAN? Because it seemed like, at least from what we observed, which is again teeny tiny sample size, many of them seemed to skew a little bit older, like those that disclosed their age, that is, in like their 70s and such. Some were as young as like 35, though. One was in his last year of college. I think that one was particularly for a Clinton case. But I'm really interested in learning more, if not about sex scandals, who's the type of person that called in and why.
Yeah, and I would just add quickly to that the you know, I think that this is just like a broad, like, so the C-SPAN calls are just one of many of this type of dynamic that exists in the United States that people encounter like all the time if you listen to like talk radio or whatever. And so I think that there's a real interesting piece to be written about that subject, and yeah, I just think it's really interesting, and I think that the way that you presented it in this paper or in this project is exactly how you'd want to position this type of research, where you're tying it to this like broader theory, but you know the hook of it is that there's these funky calls that happen all the time, and these like people who call in day after day after day, and it just sounds like a fantastic, you know, honestly, it'd be a great like book project where you have some sort of broader theory that you're tying this into, and you just have a lot of these, you have enough room to kind of breathe in the manuscript where you can kind of lean into some of these quirky examples and whatnot, which I think would be really compelling.
Definitely something to keep in mind for the future.
Yes, Mary Fran.
So Caitlin, nice presentation. I enjoyed it. It was nice thinking back to Amanda too, who's been away for a little while. We miss her. But actually my question is for Robert. So Robert, based on what Caitlin and Bryce were just talking about, does C-SPAN keep any kind of demographic data on the callers? I know they present some of it when the calls are occurring, but is there any of that data that exists that might be helpful if Caitlin wanted to continue along the lines that she was just talking about?
No, what they would keep would be the cities, and in the old days they kept track of the cable systems where people would, because they wanted to show their cable providers the range of calls that they got. But no, there is, to Bryce's point, they do use a caller blocking feature so that if somebody calls too many times, they're only supposed to call once every 30 days, so that they might block the call if they see that number showing up more often. But no, there's no demographic data. I know Jay McCann in political science is interested in doing some work with call-ins on party, and so you might talk with him at some point and might get some ideas of how he's thought about classifying calls.
Does C-SPAN keep track of that affiliation that people report? Like if they're independent, they're Republican?
No, that's no, you'd have to do that from the calls. Like, what line are you calling on?
Okay,
Yeah.
just curious.
Mm-hmm.
If you would have to give me enough time, but I would be happy to, if you wanted to go down the call-in route, I would be happy to help you figure out what party these people are part of, and that would be free of charge. It would just because I think it would be cool to see this project in action. So happy to assist.
The main way we identified People's Party was again by which line they called in on and whether or not the host said which line they were from. Most often they did, except for like the couple of videos we had where that it wasn't by party, the lines, it was by region, either East Coast,
Mhm.
Central,
Mhm.
West Coast Mountain. But yeah, it took many careful clipping of all 418 individual callers.
Did you break down that at all? Like, you know, a Republican person accused and then Republican callers, Democratic callers?
We haven't broken it down like in a matrix sort of like that yet. Though that's probably something that we could
Mhm.
look at and consider editing into.
Mhm.
But yeah, otherwise we have a spreadsheet of all of the callers we have and multiple sheets within the file of here it is by video, here it is by, and just sorting it based on the time range we used, whether or not we could identify the party, and whether to what extent we could sort of pick out, is this likely going to be a man or a woman based on like their name, their voice, whether or not they like vocally disclosed it.
Mhm. Mhm.
It was
How
certainly a
how
labor of love.
how soon after this? How long after the scandal did you have call-ins? Was it like immediately?
It seemed like most of them were sort of very soon after.
Mhm.
For example, when we were looking, we saw that for like example, the Clinton Lewinsky scandal, that they had a call in about it just a couple years ago in 2018 as sort of like a callers, let's look back on it like 20 years later and such. So we did exclude that one just so we could focus on sort of more the immediate reactions. And so some of them were also following those specific press briefings or public testimonies that we looked at.
Okay. That's useful. Thank you.
Any more questions? All right, if that's all, we're 3 minutes early, so we'll go ahead and end this session, but let's thank Caitlin and Andrea again for their presentations.